follow up on the eloquent 1 minute by my friend Doug Malfa, that it is extraordinary to think that the President of the United States, about whom some say he's the leader of the free world, would actually say publicly, and even worse, at a conference of world leaders, that in effect the worst blow we could hit ISIS with is for the leaders to come together on climate change? It's hard to believe a leader of the free world would make such a statement. Maybe it was just something that was given to him to read and he read. Maybe it was in a teleprompter. Maybe he didn't have time to think about what he was saying. Because I've talked to too many people in all parts of the world who have dealt directly with radical Islamist terrorists. And they make clear, radical Islamist terrorists know nothing and respect nothing but power. Incredible, just incredible. I mean, growing up, it would have been akin to bullies beating up, taking from smaller students on a playground, and the teacher gathering all the students and other teachers together and saying, I'm going to teach the bullies a lesson by just ignoring them and reading you a lovely story from our library. I mean, who wouldn't understand that the next day the bullies would be beating people up again and robbing again? It's incredible. Such insanity followed a terrible event, shooting in Colorado Springs. As a judge, former prosecutor, I know the man that did this needs to be punished. It's wrong, and no one should use any excuse to go in and shoot other people, whether it's an Islamic terrorist or whether it's a deranged, mentally unstable person thinking they have some kind of score to even with people they don't even know, shooting people about whom they know nothing. This story from November 30th, Fox News, about the 3 people killed in Colorado. FoxNews.com. 2 civilians killed in Friday's shooting at a Colorado Planned Parenthood clinic were identified by authorities and family members on Sunday. Jennifer Markowski, 35, was accompanying a friend to the Colorado Springs Planned Parenthood clinic when she was killed in the shooting rampage, her father told the Denver Post. John R. King said she grew up in Hawaii and met her husband, Paul, before the couple moved to Colorado when he was stationed there for the military. King told the Post from his home in Hawaii that Markowski was a kind-hearted, lovable person with 2 children. The second civilian killed was identified as Kier Stewart, 29. Amber Butler, a lifelong friend and family spokeswoman, told the Associated Press. Butler said that Stewart was accompanying someone to the clinic and leaves behind two girls, 11 and 5, who live in Texas. Stewart served in the Army's 4th Infantry Division and was deployed to Iraq. Said he would often send her letters describing the horrors he saw on the front lines. Quote, "He would tell me how terrible it was, how many guys he watched die. It was terrible for him," Butler told the Associated Press. The Army stationed Stewart at Fort Carson in Colorado Springs in 2013 before he was discharged from the military the following year. Quote, "He went someplace where people expect to die only to come back and be killed," unquote. And she also said he was a stand-up guy. He would take a bullet for you. He was the most sincere person I'd ever met. Markovsky and Stewart's identities were confirmed by officials who said a full identification would be provided once autopsies were completed on Monday. The third victim was Garrett Swayze, who worked as a police officer at the University of Colorado Springs, and was called to assist with an active shooter at the nearby clinic. Swayze was married with 2 children and a co-pastor at Hope Chapel, where he was remembered Sunday by parishioners who watched a video of him ice skating. Another quote, "We are learning that eyewitnesses confirm that the man who will be charged with the tragic, senseless shooting that resulted in the deaths of 3 people and injuries to 9 others at Planned Parenthood Health Center, Colorado Springs, by opposition to safe and legal abortion," Planned Parenthood Rocky Mountain CEO Vicki Cowart said. Well, that's from Vicki Cowart. That does not appear to be official. And it always seems, if it works better, I mean, for example, I would hope that the president's learned by now he shouldn't give opinions about shootings until he knows more about them. Don't condemn a policeman when it turns out the policeman was entirely justified, because by doing so, you help stir up and divide this nation that needs to come together. So there are so many questions. When I was a prosecutor, when I was a judge, I wanted to know motive. I want to know what caused people to do what they did. We know why Islamic terrorists do what they do. They think that that's contributing to the caliphate. And if they happen to die, just as Thomas Jefferson was told, was reported that Jefferson asked why the Barbary pirates kept attacking American ships when, they weren't a threat to that Muslim area. Reportedly told that we believe we go to paradise if we're killed while we're fighting infidels like you. So we know what motivates most Islamic terrorists. Either they think they're going to go to paradise, what a surprise they're going to get, or they think they're contributing to bringing the world under a totalitarian domination by one theocrat like the Ayatollah Khomeini or al-Baghdadi, who's head of ISIS. So with that tragedy just in our rearview mirror, unfortunately, once again, the president, in front of a massive group, spoke without thinking about what he was saying. I don't know whether it was on a teleprompter again and he just hadn't thought about what he was reading to the public. Maybe somebody put something in front of him, or maybe he was talking off the cuff and hadn't really thought about what he was saying. But this article from Alex Griswold, dated today, says, while giving a press conference in Paris, President Barack Obama told reporters that the mass shootings that plague the United States just never happen in other countries. Quote, with respect to Planned Parenthood, obviously my heart goes out to the families of those impacted, unquote, Obama said in response to a reporter's question. Quote, I mean, I say this every time we got one of these mass shootings. This just doesn't happen in other countries, unquote. He's in Paris, France, where they've just buried around 130 people, mostly from mass shootings. I mean, they probably just finished the funerals, the services for the victims of the Islamic terrorists. And the president says in front of the world, so insensitively, that these shootings, like the 3 people in Colorado Springs, never happens in any other countries, as he's standing in a country where it just had 130 people killed, mainly in mass shootings. In fact, the article says the majority of the 130 deaths were in mass shooting attacks where the ISIS-affiliated terrorists attacked public places with automatic rifles. Nearly 100 people alone were killed in just one mass shooting at the Bataclan Theater. Earlier this year, Paris was also the victim of a terrorist attack targeting the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. The al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorists wielded assault rifles, killing 11 innocent people. That was in Paris. Now, I do realize this article says the 11 people with Charlie Hebdo, the publisher, the magazine, that those 11 people, it says here, were innocent. But obviously, again, a leader of the United States, our Secretary of State, John Kerry, addressed on video for the world to see this issue and basically was saying, now we can understand Charlie Hebdo people, were killed. I mean, they did, apparently, for goodness sakes, those people used the idea that they had the freedom to speak any way they wanted to. And apparently, radical Islamic terrorists were insulted, even though the president has said repeatedly, John Kerry has said repeatedly, and Hillary Clinton has said repeatedly and continues to say that these terrorist attacks by radical Islamic terrorists have nothing to do with Islam. Well, that's a head scratcher, because if the terrorist attacks on Charlie Hebdo had nothing to do with Islam, then why did John Kerry think there may have been some justification for Islamic terrorists to kill these satirists, these magazine employees, because they said something offensive about Islam. If it wasn't about Islam, then why were the terrorists killing these magazine employees because they said something about Islam? That's a head scratcher. And then when we look at what the media is saying about the Colorado Springs shooting, and we look at what people in the mainstream media, whether it's The View or other places, talk about, yeah, Hitler was a Christian. No, he wasn't. And yeah, you know, McVeigh, those Christian. Well, I'm sure that'd be a surprise to him. He seemed to brag late in life about being agnostic. Hitler certainly wasn't a Christian. So if the president, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry are right that, gee, we need to worry as much about Christians. Actually, our State Department seems to think in their reports that we need to worry more about Christians than we do about Islamic terrorists, even though there's no indication that the Colorado Springs shooter was a Christian. And I can absolutely assure you, Mr. Speaker, no matter what he says his religious affiliation is, he certainly was not a Christian, because he certainly was not following the teachings of Christ. And the Bible makes clear that we're known by our fruits. And if he's gone in and killed other people in this way, illegally, then he's certainly not following the teachings of Christ. He's not part of the government. There's no justification. There's been no trial. But it does also raise issues about the effects of the lawlessness of this administration. Whistleblowers come to me, law-abiding, moral, ethical people who want to know. We've seen that the Justice Department will go after and destroy any honest, moral, ethical whistleblower that may reflect poorly on the administration. We've seen reports of the acting Inspector General at Homeland Security changing IG reports. We get word that in the intelligence community, reports have been changed from truth to something that would not make the administration look bad. Reports now coming out about, and apparently former intelligence leader Flynn talking about this, how the truth that was coming from intelligence in 2012 did not match up with this administration's re-election campaign, so they just changed the reports. Does an administration lying and being lawless have on what traditionally has been a majority law-abiding country? Can it create helplessness, a feeling or a need that perhaps we need to take the law into our own hands? I would tell anyone that's never justified. You do it through lawful means, through the government. Jefferson might say otherwise. But what effect does it have when the law of the land, the federal administration governing, ruling over the country, required by the Constitution to follow the laws that have been passed by Congress and signed by other presidents this president may not agree with, And he just disregards the laws, say, on amnesty, disregards the laws about it govern the EPA, so they just make up new regulations. And you just create 79,000 pages of new regulations as if you're a dictator-in-chief. I mean, what if hypothetically that were happening, what effect would it have on people who believed in having a law-abiding country? When the administration over the country becomes so lawless, it seems surely it would create feeling of desperation. What do? I've talked to whistleblowers who had that feeling. What do? I can't go to the Justice Department with the truth about what's going on because they'll prosecute me. They'll destroy my family. I'll never be able to make a living again. I've seen what they do to whistleblowers who just want the administration to be honest and follow the law. What do? Where do you go? I would submit that the place you go is not to Russia to give away our utmost secrets, because that is treason. But bound to be mitigating when an administration makes it so tough to just come forward and state the truth. We find out that this administration had known about General Petraeus' affair for most of a year, but they waited until General Petraeus was in a position to destroy the election possibilities, re-election possibilities for President Obama. And they flowed out about the affair they'd known about for most of the year. And he's destroyed. They prosecute him because apparently, as I understand it, he provided a calendar to his biographer, and search as they might for anything that they might could hang around his neck of being a lawless activity. To understand it, they found something in his calendar that could have been said to be classified, and so he agreed to plead to that. And we find out yesterday there apparently have been around 1,000 Hillary Clinton emails so far that contain classified information. If Chuck Colson gets a year and a half for having information he's not supposed to, Petraeus' life, his livelihood is ruined because they're finally able to find something that should have been classified that he pleads guilty to, having turned over to his biographer. How long do you get for doing that 1,000 times? Just asking, Mr. Speaker. But if, let's say hypothetically it were true, what President Obama, John Kerry, and Hillary Clinton keep saying, that you should not say anything negative about the terrorists who claim to be Islamic and who say Allahu Akbar, praise be to Allah, and then they kill innocent people. You can't say anything that's related to radical Islam, because that only makes matters worse. Well, if they really believe those things they've been saying, and if it were even true, and if Homeland Security is right that we need to worry about evangelical Christians or people that believe in the authority of the United States Constitution, then shouldn't the President, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry, be worried that they're going to stir up another crusade by besmirching and maligning Christianity and Christians as routinely as they do, saying, you know, these Christian terrorists are so bad, or pointing out, no, we've got bad Christians, we've got the Crusades. Well, if Christianity is as big a threat to commit violence as people who say they're Islamic terrorists or jihadists, then I'm just asking, Mr. Speaker, wouldn't that indicate that the President, Hillary Clinton, John Kerry are actually going to be responsible if a Christian goes and does something violent? I mean, using their own logic, if they're out there running down Christians as a threat to violence while saying you can't say anything negative about radical Islam, and a Christian does something wrong, well, if you're saying we stir up radical Islamic terrorists by talking about them, then wouldn't you be responsible if you, generic, indefinite you, be responsible for saying bad things about a Christian if a Christian then does something violent? I'm just asking, applying the President's own logic or lack thereof. There's an article from 4 months ago by Kyle Becker that said, after the tragic Charleston shooting that left 9 Americans dead, President Obama said the following, but let's be clear, and I'm quoting the President, this was 4 months or so ago, at some point we as a country will have to reckon with the fact that this type of mass violence does not happen in other advanced countries. It doesn't happen in other places with this kind of frequency. Said that 4 months or so ago and said it again now while he's in Paris, where 130 people were just killed in a mass attack. But this article was written 4 months ago, and it actually charts and says, since most statistics on mass shootings in the world compare apples and oranges by not correcting for population, let's get a chart that makes sense, shall we? So between 2009 and 2013, the author goes through and charts the loss of even one life should not be occurring. And as someone who has looked a defendant in the eye and ordered him to be taken by the Texas Department of Criminal Justice and taken and held until he is put to death, and have signed the order requiring a multiple murderer or a kidnapping murderer, torturer, be put to death. I know every life matters. Every life matters. Every little baby that's cut up and sold for parts matters. How about the lawlessness of seeing the Planned Parenthood videos and not only not be offended or finding those grotesque and inhumane, but actually having the Department of Justice stand ready to be the criminal defense firm for Planned Parenthood, stand by Planned Parenthood in these alleged horribly egregious violations of humanity. Would that invoke helplessness? It shouldn't invoke anybody to violence, but could it? According to this article by Kyle Becker, between 2009 through 2013, rampage shooting fatalities per 1 million people, Norway had 15.3, Finland had 1.85, Slovakia had 1.47, Israel had 1.38, Switzerland had 0.75 per million, and the United States had 0.72 per million. Even one is too many, and the perpetrator should and must be punished. But if someone has committed crimes in Planned Parenthood, shouldn't we have an administration that believes in enforcing the laws and at least doing a proper investigation on whether what was said in the videos were true, which certainly indicated orally that there were apparent crimes committed? Well, since every life matters, every black life matters, not just black lives that are needlessly killed by or taken by a white person, every black life matters, no matter who takes the life. This article from the Chicago Tribune reports, holiday toll, 8 killed, 20 wounded over Thanksgiving weekend. Seems rather calloused. The article says 8 people were killed, including a 16-year-old boy, and at least 20 others were wounded in shootings over the Thanksgiving weekend in Chicago, an increase over the last year as the number of gunshot victims rose above 2,700 for the year. 2,700 gunshot victims in Chicago, when Chicago has such strong gun control laws in place? How could that be? Is it possible that having toughest gun control laws like Washington, D.C. has had doesn't stop violent murders? And in fact, is it possible that places that have the strictest gun control have become murder capitals? Certainly appears so in Chicago and Washington, D.C. This article from Chicago Tribune says, my son, Dunnan, 16, was among the first victims of the long holiday weekend. He was shot in the head a few minutes before midnight, just west of Kidsey Avenue on Van Buren Street in East Garfield Park, about a block from his home. Police said 2 people walked up and fired at Dunnan. He was pronounced dead at the scene. 4 other people were wounded between 3 p.m. and 2:30 a.m. 2 men were killed and 4 others wounded from 1:20 p.m. on Thanksgiving Day to 3:15 a.m. on Friday. 36-year-old man was killed and 2 people, including a 14-year-old boy, were wounded between Friday afternoon and early Saturday morning. Most violent stretch occurred Saturday into Sunday when 3 men were fatally shot and at least 4 other people were wounded. Father of 3, home for holidays, dies in back of the yards shooting. Between Sunday afternoon, early Monday, an eighth person was killed and 6 other people wounded. Told during last Thanksgiving's weekend in Chicago was 5 killed, 14 wounded. That included a fatal shooting inside the Nordstrom store on North Michigan Avenue. Well, if the president's precious ideas on gun control that certainly his former chief of staff, Rahm Emanuel, would have in place in Chicago, since he has such power to effectuate the passage city leaders of ordinances for tough gun control, how could this be? The number of homicides is 444. So far this year, there have been at least 22,740 shootings in Chicago, up more than 400 from the same time last year. Number of homicides is 444, an increase of 42 from last year. That is tragic. An article by Charles C.W. Cook, November 23rd, 2015. Anyone who would use terror as an excuse to subvert the Second Amendment should be tarred and feathered. Rather interesting position. Article from Charlie Spearing, 30 November 2015. In his inaugural speech at the COP21 Climate Change Summit in Paris, President Obama acknowledged the terrorist attacks that occurred in the city earlier this month, but warned his fellow leaders not to be distracted from focusing on the looming threat of global warming. The President was quoted saying, "What greater rejection of those who would tear down our world than marshaling our best efforts to save it?" Ignoring the violent terrorism Islamic jihadists are infecting upon the world, talking about climate change, and obviously, I mean, most thinking people know it's called climate change now, and certainly not a correlation can be, it's not provable it was man-made. I do believe in climate change. We have it 4 times a year in East Texas where I live. So we know climate change is a fact. We know that the weather normally works in cycles. We had a witness before our Natural Resources Committee, knows a great deal about climate. And I asked him, is it true that planet Earth had to have been warmer during the days of Leif Erikson crossing the North Atlantic when the Norse came to Greenland? Is it true that the planet Earth was warmer then? And it turns out, according to his testimony, the planet was much warmer then. Now, we don't know what kind of fuel, what kind of carbon emissions those Norse boats were putting into the atmosphere. But I guess you'd have to figure those Norse must have really been putting out some pollution on those ships with the sails on them to have created a warmer planet back then than we have now. Apparently they were growing crops, places on Greenland where you can't anymore. My friend Ben Shapiro has an article, The Daily Wire, titled 5 Reasons Obama's Climate Change Agenda is Dangerous. Part of the word's blacked out after that. But one reason he has highlighted is because we have no idea to what extent the earth is warming. And he sets out some data and facts there, resources there rather. Number two, we have no clue how much human activity causes climate change. And I would add, if any. But of course, we'd call it climate change now because the data did not support the global warming that was being used in a fear-mongering fashion to scare people. And so by changing from global warming to climate change, that would allow them to say in the 70s, as they did, that we're at the beginning of a new ice age, and then 30 years later say we're heading toward cataclysmic global warming that will destroy all life on planet Earth. And now, after the long pause in warming that seems to be inexplicable to scientists, after the release of private emails, information from the University of East Anglia some years back that showed how data indicated data was being manipulated, it reflected things that weren't true about so-called global warming or climate change. Ben Shapiro's third point, we have no idea how much climate change impacts human life. Has discussion and references there. Then, fourth, we have no idea what level of de-development would be necessary to maintain our current climate. Fifth, the solution, destroying carbon-based fuels and capitalism is the problem. He says, the left is in an all-out war with the two greatest forces for fighting poverty in history: cheap carbon-based energy and capitalism. The same people celebrating the end of the Industrial Revolution economic model seem to forget that that economic model, boosted by carbon-based fuels, have led to a massive drop in global poverty. In 1990, 1.9 billion lived under $1.25 per day, as opposed to 836 million in 2015. That's because of the dominance of capitalism and the increased efficiency of technology. It's certainly not because of governmental environmental regulations. Some on the left seem eager to try out their theory that we can maintain our current standard of living while hopping in a time machine back to less usage of carbon without reference to market efficiencies. This is foolishness. We have time machines. They're called airplanes. Folks on the left ought to fly to countries where people don't have coal or oil or natural gas or free markets and watch them burn cow chips for heat to see how lovely and natural that lifestyle actually is. But President Obama has his goals. How many people will have to suffer or die globally because of them isn't really the issue. After all, to question him would make us cynical, he assures us. If cynicism means saving lives, then perhaps we all ought to be cynical of his world-conquering, unscientific, redistributionist nonsense. Going back to February 7th, 2015, an article from Christopher Booker from the Telegraph titled, the fiddling with temperature data is the biggest science scandal ever. He said 2 weeks ago under the headline, How We Are Being Tricked by Flawed Data on Global Warming, I wrote about Paul Homewood, who on his, not a lot of people know about that blog, had checked the published temperature graphs for 3 weather stations in Paraguay against the temperatures that had originally been recorded. In each instant, the actual trend of 60 years of data had been dramatically reversed, so that a cooling trend was changed to one that showed a marked warming. This was the latest of many examples of a practice long recognized by expert observers around the world, one that raises an ever larger question mark over the entire official surface temperature record. Following my last article, Homewood checked a swath of other South American weather stations around the original 3. In each case, he found the same suspicious one-way adjustments. First, these were made by the U.S. government's Global Historical Climate Network. They were then amplified by 2 of the main official service records, the Goddard Institute for Space Studies and the National Climate Data Center, which used the warming trends to estimate temperatures across the vast regions of the Earth where no measurements are taken. Yet these are the very records on which the scientists and politicians rely for their belief in, quote, global warming, unquote. Homewood has now turned his attention to the weather stations across much of the Arctic, between Canada, 51 degrees west, and the heart of Siberia, 87 degrees east. Again, in nearly every case, the same one-way adjustments have been made to show warming up to 1 degree centigrade or more higher than was indicated by the data that was actually recorded. This has surprised no one more than Traus Johnson, who was long in charge of climate research for the Iceland Met Office, and with whom Homewood has been in touch. Johnson was amazed to see how the new version completely disappears Iceland's sea ice years around 1970, when a period of extreme cooling almost devastated his country's economy. One of the first examples of these adjustments was exposed in 2007 by the statistician Steve McIntyre when he discovered a paper published in 1987 by James Hansen, the scientist later turned fanatical climate activist who for many years ran GISS, or the Goddard Institute for Space Studies. Hansen's original graph showed temperatures in the Arctic as having been much higher around 1940 than at any time since. But as Homewood reveals in his blog post, temperature adjustments transform Arctic history. Wow, Mr. Speaker, I need to read that again. I had not seen that. But Hansen's original graph showed temperatures in the Arctic as having been much higher around 1940 than at any time since. Homewood's interest in the Arctic is partly because the vanishing of its polar ice, vanishings in quotes, and the polar bears has become such a poster child for those trying to persuade us that we're threatened by runaway warming. But he chose that particular stretch of the Arctic because it is where ice is affected by warmer water brought in by cyclical shifts in a major Atlantic current. This last peaked at just the time 75 years ago when Arctic ice retreated even further than it has done recently. The ice melt is not caused by rising global temperatures at all. Of much more serious significance, however, is the way this whole manipulation of the official temperature record for reasons GHCN and GISS have never plausibly explained has become the real elephant in the room of the greatest and most costly scare the world has known. This really does begin to look like one of the greatest scientific scandals of all time. Mr. Speaker, I'm wondering if it might be possible that there is a mainstream media reporter out there with the New York Times, Washington Post, ABC, NBC, CBS, one of the mainstream, CNN, one of those that have lost so many of their viewers or readers, that might someday, against all of the criticism like Galileo got and others received, that might pick up that mantle and do a true investigation from a mainstream media outlet, facing the belittling and the criticism of all of the chicken littles that are in the mainstream media currently, and actually gather accurate data, show the fraud, show the wasted money, show the lost lives, show the suffering by running up the price of energy so high, and show just what Christopher Booker talks about as he finishes his article. This really does begin to look like one of the greatest scientific scandals of all time. As a great philosopher, Rush Limbaugh once said, "Follow the money." Many others have said it. If you hear someone saying, "Let's bring Syrian refugees in," when we know there's no adequate data to be assured of who they are, where they're really from, check, follow the money. See if they're part of those dividing up the $1 billion plus being paid to people to bring refugees into the United States. Well, Mr. Speaker, when this administration goes about driving up the prices of energy as it has, despite its best efforts, gasoline prices came down. Last I saw, they had dropped their approval of production from federal land to about 40% of the grants that had been approved during the Bush administration's 8 years. Less production being authorized by this administration. They're sicking the EPA now with these new regulations on the oil and gas industry, which will ultimately, if they're successful, Congress will stop them, as we should. The price of gasoline will skyrocket, as the President said he wanted coal-produced power to skyrocket. And as one of my senior citizen constituents had told me, I think she said she was 80, she was born in a home that only had a wood-burning stove, and because the cost of energy, well, it's gone up, she's worried she may leave this world in a home that only has a wood-burning stove. The trouble for her is, if this administration has its way, she can't have a wood-burning stove even. But when you see the cost of home energy going up as dramatically as this administration has forced it, and you realize that doesn't really hurt the rich in America to have higher prices for energy. It does hurt business, absolutely does. Means they can't give raises because they're spending that money on higher bills. So people are not keeping up with what they should. And then we found out during this administration the unthinkable occurred, and the president even admitted it on camera. For the first time in the history of this country ever, after this president's policies had been fully implemented for 5 years, 95% of the nation's income went to the top 1%. The president that talked so much about helping the middle class and helping the poor has presided over policies that have made the rich, put them in a position where 95% of income is going to the top 1%. It had never happened before. This president's policies have made life as difficult for people in America. I mean, not for the people that have all the cronyism, crony capitalism, General Electric, all those friends of the president, but I'm talking about the distance between the rich and the poor has gotten farther with fewer people in between. That's tragic. So countries swarm to the global warming conferences, and they hope to leave. Just watch, follow the money. They hope to leave with an agreement by the United States that will punish American residents and cause them to have to pay more taxes that will be paid to countries around the world. Of course they flock to these global warming, climate change conferences because they think the president is going to do what he's hoping to do and start sending checks from the American taxpayers to all of these other countries, places where their policies have stifled growth or they don't have the energy we do. How about sending them some energy? Send them some coal. They will be far better off. In closing, Mr. Speaker, let me just remind that you don't have to pay people to hate you. They'll do it for